Have you ever stopped to wonder why one of the most mysterious visions in the Bible still confuses Christians today? And why, even after centuries of theological study, there is still so much debate about who the woman of Revelation really is? Because there's an uncomfortable truth here that almost no one notices the first time they read the book of Revelation. That woman clothed with the sun might not be only who you've always been told she is. I know that sounds strange at first. After all, for a long time, many Christians grew up hearing interpretations that seemed simple enough. Some confidently say the woman described in chapter 12 of Revelation represents Mary, the mother of Jesus. Others insist the symbol points to Israel, the chosen people from whom the Messiah came. And there are also those who believe the vision represents the church itself moving through history. But here's the point almost no one mentions when this subject comes up in sermons or Bible studies. Within the theological tradition connected to the Vatican, the interpretation of this woman isn't as straightforward as it seems. In fact, it opens the door to one of the most fascinating discussions about the symbols of the end times. And this is where things start to change. Because when you return to the biblical text and read it slowly, something becomes clear. The scene described in the book of Revelation doesn't feel like a simple metaphor. What appears before the Apostle John is a vision filled with cosmic symbols, powerful imagery, and a spiritual tension that runs through the entire narrative. John writes that he saw a great sign in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, the moon beneath her feet, a crown of 12 stars on her head. She is pregnant, about to give birth, and at the same time there is an enormous red dragon waiting for the moment of the birth, ready to devour the child who is about to be born. The first time you read that description, it's almost impossible not to feel that something much larger is unfolding there. The scene feels less like a story and more like a symbolic portrait of a spiritual war stretching across generations. And that raises an unavoidable question. If this woman represents only one person, why does the vision use symbols on such a massive scale? Why do the sun, the moon, and the stars surround her? Why does a dragon appear to pursue her? Do you see how some of the pieces don't seem to fit together so easily? That's exactly why theologians, Bible scholars, and researchers of Christian tradition have debated this chapter for centuries. At first glance, the text seems simple, but the moment you start paying attention to the details, every symbol opens a new layer of meaning, and there's something even more intriguing. Throughout the history of the Church, especially within the Catholic tradition preserved in the archives and teachings of the Vatican, this vision from Revelation began to be interpreted in a way that connects several moments of salvation history at the same time. At first that might sound normal, but it really isn't, because this interpretation suggests that the woman of Revelation might not represent just a single figure within the Bible. Some scholars believe she may symbolize something much greater, a spiritual story that begins long before the birth of Christ and continues long after. If that idea feels familiar to you, stay with me, because the more we look closely at the vision described in Revelation 12, the more we realize it isn't only talking about an event from the past. It seems to reveal a spiritual conflict that runs through the entire history of faith. And when that perspective begins to unfold before our eyes, an intriguing possibility appears. Maybe that woman clothed with the sun isn't representing just one specific person, but a much larger symbol within God's own plan for humanity. And maybe that's exactly why so many people feel a certain discomfort when they start looking more closely at this vision from Revelation, because the more the details come into focus, the clearer it becomes that we're not dealing with a simple image or a quick explanation. Something deeper is happening there, something that seems to stretch across centuries of interpretation, tradition, and reflection within Christianity itself. Maybe you felt that too. Maybe at some point you read chapter 12 of Revelation and had that strange feeling that something important was hidden in those words. But at the same time, it felt difficult to fully understand, as if the text were revealing only part of the story, while the rest remained wrapped in mystery. And it's not just you. Throughout the centuries, ordinary readers, Bible scholars, theologians, and church leaders have all looked at this same vision and asked the very same question that might be forming in your mind right now. Who exactly is this woman? And why did the Bible choose such grand symbols to describe her? Do you see how that question keeps echoing even after so much time? Because when a text crosses generations and still sparks curiosity, it usually means there's something there that hasn't been fully understood yet, something that keeps inviting each new generation to look again, to reflect again, to try to see what may have gone unnoticed before. And it's interesting to realize how this search for understanding connects people who may never have met, yet share the same spiritual curiosity. People who read the scriptures, who ask questions, who try to understand the signs, who sense that certain passages of the Bible carry messages much greater than what appears at first glance. If, while listening to this conversation, some part of that resonates with you, share in the comments what caught your attention the most so far. Sometimes a simple insight you had while reading this chapter of Revelation can help someone else who is trying to understand the very same thing. That kind of exchange is what keeps these conversations alive. And when you leave a comment, or even show that this content resonated with you by liking the video, it helps the platform's algorithm bring this kind of reflection to other people who are also trying to better understand biblical prophecy, the symbols of the end times, and the interpretations preserved within Christian tradition. In the end, that's how small communities of curiosity and faith begin to form here. People who may never have had the chance to talk about these topics anywhere else, but who find a space here to reflect together, ask questions together, and discover new perspectives about texts that have been part of humanity's spiritual history for thousands of years. And if this kind of conversation interests you, if you enjoy exploring biblical mysteries, ancient interpretations, and the things that often go unnoticed in faster readings of Scripture, following the channel is a way to keep taking part in these discoveries we'll continue making together in the videos ahead, because the more we return to the text of Revelation and examine each detail carefully, the more some of the pieces begin to fall into place in unexpected ways. And it's exactly at that point that the vision of the woman clothed with the sun starts to reveal something even more intriguing, something many readers of the Bible pass right over without noticing, but that completely changes the way this passage can be understood. Now, I want to go even deeper into this subject, because when we begin to look closely at what actually appears in the theological teachings connected to the Vatican, we start to realize that many things that seem simple at first glance actually carry much broader layers of meaning. A lot of people believe the Catholic Church simply states that the woman in Revelation is Mary, the mother of Jesus, and that the discussion ends there. That's probably the most popular explanation, the one you hear in quick conversations, in comments, online, or even in surface-level interpretations of religious texts. But when you step behind the scenes of the Christian theological tradition, you begin to see that this interpretation is only the beginning of something much larger, because within the biblical mindset, especially in the way many Catholic theologians have learned to read Scripture over the centuries, symbols rarely carry just one isolated meaning. More often, they function like windows that reveal different dimensions of the same spiritual truth. That might sound like a small detail, but the impact of that way of interpreting Scripture is enormous. When scholars connected to the Vatican tradition analyze chapter 12 of Revelation, they don't see just a single character inside a prophetic narrative. They see a symbolic image that seems to stretch across multiple moments in the history of the Christian faith. And this is where an interesting realization begins to emerge. In Catholic theology, the woman described in Revelation can be understood on three levels at the same time, not as interpretations competing with one another, but as dimensions that complement each other within the same spiritual vision. First, many theologians recognize that the figure of the woman has a deep connection with Mary, the mother of Jesus. After all, the text speaks of a woman who gives birth to the one who will rule the nations, a reference that naturally links the vision to the birth of the Messiah. In that sense, Mary appears as a powerful symbol within this prophecy. But the story doesn't stop there. When scholars begin to look more closely at the other elements of the vision, the sun, the moon, the crown of 12 stars, something curious begins to appear. Those symbols strongly resemble an earlier image found in the book of Genesis, when Joseph dreams about the sun, the moon, and the 12 stars representing his family. Almost no one notices that connection at first, because at that moment, the symbol of the woman begins to point not only to Mary, but also to Israel, the people who carried the promise of the Messiah through generations, the nation that prepared the historical and spiritual path for the birth of Christ. And when you bring those two dimensions together, Mary and Israel, something interesting starts to happen in the interpretation, because the vision seems to speak at the same time about a specific person and about an entire people. That completely changes the perspective of the passage. But there is still a third layer that makes this interpretation even deeper. Within the Catholic tradition, many theologians also understand that the woman can symbolize the church itself, not simply as a visible institution, but as the spiritual community that continues carrying the message of Christ into the world. In that sense, the church also gives birth to Christ continually, not in a physical way, but in a spiritual one. Every generation that receives the gospel, every inner transformation that happens in someone's life, every decision that brings a person closer to truth, all of that becomes part of this spiritual journey that began long before us. And suddenly, the image of the woman clothed with the sun stops being just an intriguing detail in the book of Revelation. It begins to represent a spiritual story that runs through the entire Bible. Mary, Israel, the church, three dimensions that seem to converge inside the same prophetic vision. At first, that may sound complex, but at the same time it reveals something fascinating about the way the Bible uses symbols to speak about spiritual processes much larger than a single moment in history. Because once this vision begins to open up in that way, the woman of Revelation stops being just a character in an ancient text and starts to represent a spiritual journey that connects past, present, and future within God's plan. And it's exactly at this point that many people begin to realize that this vision might be revealing something even deeper about the spiritual conflict described in Revelation. Because if the woman represents a story that stretches across generations, then the persecution that appears in the vision may also be revealing something about the very journey of faith through time. And when you begin to look at the other character who appears in this scene, the dragon, the narrative takes on an even more intense dimension, because that creature doesn't appear merely as a symbolic detail. It appears as a force trying to interrupt that story, a presence that watches, waits, and attacks at the exact moment when something decisive is about to happen. Comment below. This makes sense to me. And when this piece of the puzzle begins to come into focus, the vision described in Revelation takes on an intensity that many people miss the first time they read it, because in the middle of that cosmic scene, sun, moon, stars, and the woman about to give birth, another figure suddenly appears, and it completely changes the atmosphere of the narrative. The text speaks of a great red dragon, 7 heads, 10 horns, a presence that seems to carry strength, power, and threat all at the same time. At first, this might sound like a distant symbolic image, almost like an old painting filled with metaphors. But within the traditional theological interpretation preserved by the Church over the centuries, especially in readings connected to the tradition associated with the Vatican, this character is not treated as a faceless mystery. He is identified directly. The dragon represents Satan, not simply as a mythological creature, but as the embodiment of a spiritual opposition trying to interrupt what God is building throughout history. And here's a detail that almost no one notices when they read this passage too quickly. The dragon isn't just attacking anyone, he's waiting for the birth of a child. That might seem like a small detail, but it isn't, because within Christian interpretation, the child the woman gives birth to represents Christ, the Messiah who would rule the nations, the one whose arrival would change the course of humanity's spiritual history. Suddenly, that vision stops looking like a distant allegory and begins to reveal something much deeper about the unseen side of the biblical story. According to this interpretation, Revelation is showing that from the very beginning, there was a spiritual opposition trying to prevent that plan from being fulfilled. And that completely changes the way we look at the scene, because the birth of Christ is not presented only as a historical moment within the Christian narrative. It appears as the center of a much larger spiritual battle. And maybe you've already noticed something interesting. Even after the birth of Jesus, even after Christianity spread throughout the centuries, the conflict described in this vision doesn't seem to disappear completely. That raises an unavoidable question. If the dragon tried to stop the birth of the Messiah, why does the vision continue describing persecution even after the child is protected? Now I want to go even deeper into this, because the text of Revelation itself makes something very clear. After failing to destroy the child, the dragon redirects his fury toward something else. He turns his anger toward the woman and toward her offspring. And this is where an important shift in perspective begins to happen when we look closely at the passage. Within traditional Christian interpretation, especially in the readings developed by many theologians throughout the history of the Church, Those offspring do not represent just a small, isolated group of people. They represent those who remain faithful to the message of Christ. In other words, the people of God. Do you see the weight of that idea? Because it means the vision may not be describing only an ancient event that took place 2,000 years ago. It may also be revealing something about a spiritual journey that continues to unfold throughout history. The battle described in Revelation would not simply be a closed chapter from the past. It would be part of a spiritual conflict that stretches across generations. And when that perspective begins to open before our eyes, something interesting happens. That vision that once felt distant suddenly begins to feel much closer to the reality of the person reading it. Because throughout history, Christian communities have faced persecution, crises, difficult decisions, and moments of deep transformation. In many cases, people who tried to live out their faith encountered resistance, opposition, or challenges that felt bigger than themselves. That doesn't mean everything around us is part of some invisible mystical battle, but it does show that the symbolic language of Revelation is trying to describe something that goes beyond isolated events. It speaks about a journey of faith, a journey of choices, a journey where spiritual decisions, mindset, and commitment to truth can have real impact on the way people live and face the challenges of the world. And maybe that's exactly why the book of Revelation continues to spark so much interest even today. Because it doesn't only present revelations about the future, it also raises questions about the present, about what happens behind the scenes of history, about the unseen forces that influence mindsets, decisions, and spiritual paths over time. And when the vision of the woman, the child, and the dragon begins to be seen through that wider perspective, something even more intriguing appears within the narrative. Because the text doesn't simply end with the confrontation between these figures. There is another detail that shifts the direction of the story once again. Something that happens right after the persecution begins to intensify. Something that involves protection, refuge, and an unexpected place within this symbolic journey, described in Revelation. Write in the comments, "I'm on this journey too." When this detail begins to appear within the narrative, the vision in Revelation stops feeling like an isolated symbolic scene and starts revealing a thread that stretches across centuries of history. Because right after the dragon's persecution, the text describes something unexpected. The woman flees into the wilderness. At first, that may seem like a small detail, but within Christian theological tradition, this moment carries enormous meaning. Throughout the entire Bible, the wilderness is never just a geographical place. It represents transformation, preparation, and often protection in the middle of danger. It was in the wilderness that the people of Israel walked through a decisive journey after leaving Egypt. It was in the wilderness that prophets faced deep crises before important shifts in their mission. And it was in the wilderness that Jesus himself spent a period of spiritual confrontation before beginning his ministry. So when this image appears again in Revelation, it seems to carry that same symbolic logic. The woman flees into the wilderness, but she is not abandoned. The text says that there she is sustained, protected, kept in a way that reveals something intriguing about the unseen side of this spiritual story. And it's exactly at this point that some Catholic theologians began to see a profound turning point in the interpretation of this chapter. Because when this vision is viewed through the lens of the history of the Christian faith, something curious begins to emerge. Over the centuries, the Church has gone through periods of persecution, internal crises, difficult decisions, and moments of deep transformation. Christian communities have risen in hostile environments, survived in contexts where continuing seemed almost impossible, and often found strength precisely in the moments when they appeared most vulnerable. Do you see how that pattern echoes the image of the woman in Revelation? She is persecuted, but she continues to exist. She is attacked, but she does not disappear. She is pushed into the wilderness, yet that is exactly where she finds protection. Within the theological tradition preserved by many scholars connected to the Vatican, this sequence came to be interpreted as a prophetic image of the Church's own journey throughout history. That doesn't mean every specific historical event is literally described in Revelation, but the vision seems to capture a spiritual pattern that stretches across generations, a community born out of promise, one that faces opposition, one that passes through moments of fragility, and yet continues to exist despite external pressure. When this interpretation begins to make sense, the impact of the vision grows dramatically, because the woman clothed with the sun is no longer just a figure connected to the past or to a single event. She begins to represent a living story, a spiritual journey that connects different eras of humanity within what many Christians call the history of salvation. Now I want to go even deeper into this, because when we look at the full sequence of the vision described in Revelation 12, we realize it's not only talking about persecution and protection, there's also a message about spiritual mindset, about the decisions that shape the direction of faith over time. The woman doesn't simply escape danger. She continues to exist even when the situation looks unfavorable. That image suggests something important about the dynamics of Christian faith throughout the centuries. Many of the greatest spiritual transformations happened precisely in moments of crisis. In seasons when everything seemed on the verge of disappearing, new generations found the strength to keep moving forward. And that creates an interesting connection between the vision of Revelation and the reality of human experience. Because spiritual history has never been only about comfort or stability. It has always involved difficult choices, resistance, perseverance, and a mindset capable of continuing even when the circumstances don't seem favorable. Maybe that's why so many scholars within the Christian tradition believe Revelation 12 is not describing only a symbolic episode from the past. The vision may be revealing something about humanity's own spiritual destiny, a story where the struggle between good and evil moves across generations, where spiritual decisions carry real weight in history, where every era faces its own challenges within this larger journey. And when that perspective begins to open up before us, a question emerges that completely changes the way we look at this chapter of Revelation. Because if the woman represents a spiritual journey that stretches across centuries, then the vision might also be saying something about the moment each generation finds itself within that story. Maybe it isn't just a narrative about what has already happened. Maybe it's also a revelation about what is still unfolding behind the scenes of humanity. Comment below, this makes sense to me. When this perspective begins to unfold, something interesting happens with the way we see chapter 12 of Revelation. That vision that once looked like a simple symbolic sequence, the woman, the dragon, the child, and the wilderness, starts to reveal a complexity that stretches across centuries of interpretation within the Christian tradition. And even after all this time, there are still questions that remain open. That might sound surprising, but behind the scenes of theology, even among scholars connected to the Vatican, this chapter continues to be the subject of deep reflection. Not because there is a lack of faith or tradition to interpret it, but precisely because the symbols found there seem to carry meanings that go beyond a single definitive reading. And this is where some of the most intriguing questions begin to emerge. For example, why does the woman appear wearing a crown of 12 stars? That number doesn't appear by accident in Scripture. 12 carries deep meaning throughout the biblical story. There are 12 tribes of Israel, 12 apostles, 12 symbolic foundations of the spiritual community that emerges from the message of Christ. At first that might seem simple, but when we look more closely, we begin to notice that Revelation uses these numbers in a way that seems to connect different moments in the history of faith, almost as if it were showing a continuity between the past, the present, and something that is still unfolding. Now I want to go even deeper into this, because there is another detail that also sparks curiosity among students of the Bible. The place where the woman flees is not a city, not a temple, not a place of visible power. She is taken into the wilderness. And that raises an interesting question. Why does the wilderness appear as a place of protection? From a human perspective, the wilderness seems like the opposite of safety. It's a hostile environment, isolated, silent. But within the symbolic language of Scripture, the wilderness often appears as the place where deep spiritual transformations take place. It was in the wilderness that Israel learned to depend on God. It was in the wilderness that prophets found direction in moments of crisis. It was in the wilderness that crucial decisions shaped the spiritual path of an entire people. When that pattern appears again in Revelation, some scholars see more than a simple escape. They see a metaphor for spiritual preservation during times of conflict, as if the vision is suggesting that even in seasons of pressure or persecution, there is an invisible care unfolding behind the scenes of history. But perhaps the most intriguing detail in the vision is something else. The dragon does not completely disappear from the story. Even after failing to destroy the child, and even after the woman finds protection, the text says that the dragon continues his persecution against her offspring. That point has sparked deep reflection within the theological tradition. Who are those offspring? Some scholars believe Revelation is speaking about those who remain faithful to the message of Christ across generations. Ordinary people who make spiritual choices in their own lives, often facing challenges, cultural pressures, and difficult decisions. That interpretation connects the vision of Revelation to something far greater than a single isolated episode. It begins to reflect the spiritual journey of humanity itself, a journey shaped by choices, shifts in mindset, moments of resistance, and discoveries about the truth that forms the lives of people over time. And that is exactly why Revelation remains one of the most fascinating books in the Bible, because it doesn't only present images about the end of times, it also raises questions about the present, about the impact of spiritual decisions, and about the unseen forces moving behind the story of humanity. Maybe that's why, even after centuries of study, many details of this vision are still being discussed. Some theologians believe certain symbols may be connected to spiritual events that have not yet fully revealed themselves within history. Others understand these images as enduring reminders of the struggle between forces that shape the direction of humanity. Either way, one thing seems clear. When we begin to look carefully at the vision of the woman in Revelation, it stops being just a distant mystery inside an ancient book. It becomes a narrative that stretches across generations, a story that is still being written, and perhaps the most important question is not only identifying who the woman in that vision represents. Perhaps the deeper question is something else. What role each generation, including our own, may be playing within this spiritual journey that began long before us. Comment below, this makes sense to me. And when we reach this point in the conversation, after looking closely at every detail of this vision in Revelation, the most curious feeling might be realizing that some answers begin to appear, but at the same time, new questions arise along with them. Because the more we observe the symbols, the clearer it becomes that the book of Revelation was not written simply to spark curiosity about the future. It also invites reflection about a spiritual journey that stretches across generations, about decisions that shape mindsets, and about the things that often happen quietly behind the scenes of history. Maybe that's why this vision of the woman clothed with the sun continues to capture so much attention, even after so many centuries. It's not only speaking about distant characters. It speaks about a larger story, a story where each generation has to decide how it will walk within this journey of faith, transformation, and the search for truth. And if you made it this far with me, if you stayed through this entire conversation, there's a good chance that this kind of reflection resonates with you in some way. So leave a simple comment down below, just so I know you made this journey all the way to the end with me. Write something like, "I'm with you until the end." It's always interesting to see how many people reach this point in the conversation and are reflecting on these same questions. And if at some point during the video an idea, a perspective, or a realization made you see this passage of Revelation a little differently, that simple action of liking the video helps more than it might seem, because that's what allows this kind of conversation to keep reaching other people who are also trying to understand these themes more deeply. If you enjoy this kind of content, deep conversations about biblical symbols, ancient interpretations, and mysteries that run through the history of faith, subscribing to the channel is simply a natural way to keep walking through this journey of discovery together. And before you leave, there's a video appearing right here that connects directly with what we started exploring today. It goes even deeper into some of the details that also appear in the prophecies and helps bring more context to these visions. Click on it and continue the journey with me there. Because once we start connecting these pieces, the story that once seemed fragmented begins to reveal a much greater meaning.